Hello and welcome to the Land and Climate Podcast. My name is Bertie Harrison-Broninski, and today I'm discussing nuclear fusion with Matthew Hole from Australian National University. Fusion power has been imagined as the future of human electricity generation for decades. You might have seen it in blockbuster movies powering spaceships or Iron Man suits, but in real life, we have not yet mastered the engineering to produce and sustain the continuous nuclear reactions necessary to create the abundant, clean energy that has long been promised. Professor Hole is a fusion expert. He began his career at the UK Atomic Energy Authority before founding the Australian ITER Forum, which promotes Australian involvement in the world's largest science mega-project, the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, or ITER, being constructed in southern France. He's now co-chair of the International Fusion Research Council of the International Atomic Energy Agency. I wanted to speak to Matthew about the recent surge in private investment into fusion energy, which has reached nearly $10 billion in the past 5 years. Some of these companies, which are mostly American, are promising fusion power before the end of this decade. Would that change the game for decarbonisation?
To make a statement that something is going to be realised in 5 years doesn't have any credibility. Many, if not nearly all of these companies will go bankrupt.
2 months ago in September, US Energy Secretary Chris Wright told the BBC that fusion power would be demonstrated within 5 years and would be delivering power to electricity grids in 8 to 15 years' time. I began our interview by asking Matthew what he made of these ambitious claims.
I don't have a great deal of confidence in what the US government said at the moment for lots of different reasons. But with regard in particular to the fusion private sector and claims about 5 years, even if I were to build a fossil fuel power station today, it would take at least 5 years to build it. That's excluding the siting and all the additional permissions associated with getting it licensed. I'm talking about actual construction time. So to say that I'm going to have a device that's powering society within 5 years is frankly just nonsense. It's inspirational that they have this timeline, and it's wonderful that they're bringing on this additional investment. And yes, it might de-risk and accelerate the development of fusion energy, but 5 years is just unrealistic. This is not mature technology. It's never been demonstrated before. So to say that I'm going to have something which has never been trialled or never demonstrated before to be operating to produce power within 5 years, that's a ludicrous claim. It will take at least until the mid-2030s, not till late 2030s, to operate in burning plasma regimes, which is the condition required to produce net burning power. So this is not to say that the investment is not welcome. Of course it's welcome, and it can accelerate fusion energy development. But to make a statement that something is going to be realised in 5 years doesn't have any credibility.
If we backtrack a little bit now to lay out some of the basics, perhaps you could talk us through just a kind of 101, what is fusion and what would be the benefits to the energy system or the energy grid of a given country?
So fusion is a process that powers the stars and the sun. So the sun works by the proton cycle chain, which combines protons to form helium, and eventually ultimately through stellar synthesis, all the other heavier elements. But the sun works by operating at 2 billion atmospheres at a density 150 times that of lead in the core. Now, there's no way we can possibly reproduce those conditions on Earth. Only a star can do that. And it's an incredible volume. So instead, what we try to do is try to confine a hot plasma at actually much hotter conditions than the core of the sun. We can do that, but we can never approach the density of the sun. And so what we're trying to do is approach something which has sufficiently high temperature that the Coulomb cross-section, so when I bring two charges together, the like particles will oppose each other unless they get very close together, in which case the strong nuclear force will take over and bind them together and cause a fusion reaction. So to do that, it has to be extremely hot. And so what one is trying to do is do this at sufficiently large numbers and sufficiently high volume to produce net power. And so that's the attraction. If you could get fusion to work for society, the core fuel is like heavy isotopes of hydrogen. So hydrogen is nearly about 99% of the universe. To get heavy isotopes of hydrogen, you can find it at heavy water, for example. So deuterium, for every 6,000 hydrogen atoms, that's one deuterium. Getting tritium is a bit more difficult because tritium has a half-life of 12.5 years. It doesn't exist in nature, but you can activate it from lithium. the challenge of running a DT fusion experiment or fusion power device requires generation of tritium. That's not a demonstrated technology either. There are different pathways to do that. Demonstration of tritium supply has still yet to occur. It's still a research topic.
And given the scarcity of tritium, what is the appeal of using that instead of just deuterium? And I suppose, is there a lithium supply challenge potentially in the future if we do go with the tritium route?
The reason for using tritium is simply because it's the one that's easiest to initiate. So if you're going to do any type of fusion reaction, the one which is easiest to initiate on Earth is deuterium-tritium. So that's the reason why we follow that. We have, to first order, you would use that fuel cycle reaction. The DD reaction has a slightly lower cross-section. Of course, that would be ideal because it's still a relatively high cross-section. But the challenge for fusion is to get it to be sustaining. So in the first instance, you try to find the path that's easiest to do. And so that's the deuterium-tritium reaction. There is some hope that if you get a tritium power plant to work, future generations would be a different fuel cycle. They would be deuterium only. But in the first instance, you would use deuterium-tritium. So yes, the lithium is a rare earth commodity. But if you use DD, there's millions of years supply. If you use lithium, I still believe the estimates are of order of 100,000 years or longer. So it's still a vast amount of energy for our civilization. But as I said, generation of tritium from lithium is still a research challenge. It can be done, but it's not demonstrated technology.
Could you tell us a bit more about ITER? I know that you work on this a lot, and it might be a bit interesting to hear about the history as well. I know it's originated in the 70s?
Well, the idea goes back to the 70s, but I think the actual project itself was spawned as an agreement between Gorbachev and Reagan, a path forward during the Cold War. And because it had this international foundation of a multi-party activity, it gradually expanded as a multi-party activity to now 35 partners and alliances all over the globe. And so if you were asked the question, if I wanted to build a machine the scale of ITER using a multi-party investment strategy, is that the best way to do it? The answer is probably not. And the reason why I say that is because let's suppose you have 18 toroidal field coils. Because of the way the procurement was divided, 9 of them have to be done in one country, 3 in another, 3 somewhere else. So you end up having bits manufactured all over the place, and then you have a problem that the machine might not fit together when you put it together because they're different factories. So this is perhaps not the ideal pathway, I think, if you wanted to produce a leading science experiment. And this ITER's not an exception. Hubble had the same problems as well. They put it into space and realized it didn't work, and for partly similar reasons. Because of scale, it's clear that a multinational approach is desirable, but because also national governments want the return in terms of infrastructure and contracts delivered to their industry, it means that it's probably not necessarily the right way forward to do it. But putting aside the model, it is a very challenging project. It's probably the hardest thing man has ever done or human race has ever done. So it's perhaps not surprising that it's taken longer than was anticipated. ITER had some other challenges as well. It had some challenges of management approach. The early directors of ITER had a very different style because it's an international project and a cultural experiment of how to manage large groups of engineers and scientists from different nations divided via different cultures. So it's a truly international project which has had some challenges, but it is nonetheless a couple of toroidal vacuum vector sections put together now. It is not only on track, it's possibly even slightly ahead of track, which is unusual. I still think that, despite the claims of the private sector, I still think it is likely to probably be, if not the first to have fusion plasma environments, certainly the first to operate in a burning regime of Q greater than 5, just because these are massively complicated experiments to build. I mean, the hope is that once you generate the science and the understanding, you make it significantly cheaper. And if you look at the first car engine, it was hopelessly inefficient. But over iterations, it became to the point where it's not only efficient but reliable. And of course, the technology changed again, and so electric is now attractive. But my point being is that first of a kind will not be particularly attractive.
Could you say a little bit more about those managerial differences you were referring to? What kind of thing were you talking about?
The first Director General was a Japanese diplomat, and so he didn't really have any understanding at all of fusion energy technology or science. And that was done because ITER was the site selection. Both Japan and Europe wanted it desperately. In the end, Europe succeeded in winning the ITER contract for the bid itself, but the consequence was that a Japanese director was put in place. And because the director that was chosen was a diplomat, so that created some challenges that were of human nature and had nothing to do with science and technology. There have been lots of integration problems, not so much integration problems, but because of the nature of distribution of manufacturing across the globe and bringing all these components together, ITER will also be an integration exercise and challenge. And it's had some of those challenges already. But it's making remarkable progress given the scale of the problem and the difficulty in procuring or establishing a burning plasma experiment.
Imagine that some people might hear you talk of integration challenge with different components and think, God, that sounds quite scary, a big nuclear reactor. But I've also seen people say before that nuclear fusion doesn't have the safety risks that fission has. To what extent is that true? Well, are there kind of major security risks with fusion reactors?
The big challenge in fusion is getting the reaction to occur at all. So it's not like a fission power plant where the machine, it's possible for the reaction to run away without control rods. It's more the case that the challenge with a fusion reaction is to maintain those conditions for the reaction to occur at all. Pretty much anything will stop the reaction. If the machine stops operating and there's loss of control, there's no danger to worker health. There's a lot of damage that can be done to the experiment itself because it could damage some of the first-wall components. And the amount of tritium stored in the device is pretty small. So even if there was a total release of tritium, I believe there's lots of various accident reports that look at the background risk, and there would still be background levels at the site perimeter. Tritium is not a good substance to drink or breathe, but even in the event of the unimaginable case of floods of total release, the amount of fuel in the machine is tiny. So there's not really a danger to the general public. The biggest danger, to be honest, is that it's an expensive piece of infrastructure in the same way as blowing up the Eiffel Tower or the Sydney Harbour Bridge would be a massive amount of damage that's occurred. Destroying a very large piece of infrastructure would cost many billions of dollars and set society back decades at least. So that's the biggest danger, is that it's inadvertently become some sort of target for attack. But the same thing happens with big dams, important pieces of national infrastructure. This is not new. Governments protect those things all the time. The last element is that it doesn't generate the long-lived radioactive waste that at the moment conventional fission does, and I use the word conventional, I mean generation 3 uses. Next generation fission power plants will have lower level waste because fusion doesn't generate any direct radioactive waste itself. It generates indirect waste because it activates the vessel wall by neutrons. After operation of a fusion power plant, there's no direct waste, but there's a fair bit of indirect waste because the facility itself is activated. But we believe it is possible to reduce it to a greenfield site. It might take the order of 100 years, but that's significantly less than thousands of years. At the end of the day, society is living totally unsustainably. So we have a choice to make. Anything you do has a cost.
That's why I asked about that in terms of security risk to people or environment or anything else, is that I believe the UK and the EU both have policy documents expected in the first few months of 2026. There's the EU fusion strategy and the UK's national policy statement about fusion. And they both seem to be leaning towards deregulation being part of those policies, kind of this program of cutting red tape, trying to speed up industrial development. And so I was interested to ask, is there a red tape issue with fusion?
Well, I think particularly in the West, nuclear technology and power is regulated as a fission device, and the regulations around fission are quite stringent for good reason. The challenge has been is that you don't want default regulations applying from fission to fusion because the technology risk is much, much lower, and it's a different energy technology. ITER itself has faced this problem that some of the French nuclear regulations, which apply to fission, have been applied to ITER, and that's slowed things down. So there is a known challenge that, as I said, in the West, particularly where safety is paramount, that using fission regulations to apply to a new technology, fusion, would be the wrong thing to do. So there is an element that regulatory framework should be different. And to a degree, that has been partially recognised in that fusion is often identified as an accelerator or a medical device as opposed to a fission device, but I'm sure there's a lot more that can be done in that space. I don't think it's a scientific or demonstration barrier at the moment because we haven't demonstrated it. If it were demonstrated technology and it was being impeded immediately by regulation, then yes, it would be an immediate barrier. The UK and the EU are looking at as part of a barrier to deployment, but it needs to be done obviously hand in hand with the scientific and engineering development that were required to realise a fusion device. So I think they're probably just planning ahead. In the case of the UK, they have a very ambitious plan of developing this spherical tokamak electricity pilot plant to produce power by 2040. They are looking at regulation in that framework. I guess what I would say is the regulation aspect is a known issue. It comes up repeatedly at IAEA meetings, partly because the IAEA would be a good place to develop those regulatory frameworks because that's part of what IAEA does. But I don't think it's the roadblock. In other parts of the world, not so much where safety, but where processes can be more easily overridden or rewritten, like China, for example, I think it's not much of a roadblock at all. So it's particularly in the West where regulation will, if by default fission regulation is adopted, it could easily set back fusion development.
To what extent is the development of fusion energy a geopolitical race? I mean, I know you talked about how many different countries are involved in ITER, but the space race seems to be heating up a little bit again in a way that it hasn't for decades, and there is this kind of trade war now between the US and China. Does fusion fit into that heating up of tensions between countries around science and R&D?
I think it does to a degree, certainly in the sense that China is pouring a lot of resources into this technology. China has ramped up its activity in fusion science and engineering significantly over the last 20, 30 years. And so it now has a fairly, not as well as established activity as the US or Europe, or even Japan for that matter, but it does have a developing understanding. And so the degree to which it's geopolitical, well, I guess the US certainly views it that way in the sense that they are encouraging a pathway from the Department of Energy. They want the role of the public sector is to support the private sector in realising fusion energy, and they're viewing this through the lens of a geopolitical contest, partly with China. I don't know whether Europe has quite the same outlook. Their outlook tends to be much longer term. The European Union has been great at long-term planning and over a long period of time, whereas the US tends to flip more on a dime in terms of policy direction. But there is no doubt that the world is becoming more geopolitically charged. I mean, the argument that's often sometimes given, I've heard, is that if China beats the US to fusion energy, its supremacy will be assured. I'm not so sure that that argument is true. There's lots of different technologies being developed. I think there is certainly a risk. Whoever is first to market will have a massive competitive advantage. That's true of any technology, and that is certainly true of fusion. But as I said, first to market, I don't think will happen within 5 years.
With these companies that are making quite short-term promises, do you think they're likely to go bankrupt or face quite serious issues if they do fail to deliver? Or is it such a state-sponsored, subsidized industry, or is there such usefulness to the research that happens regardless of what milestones are crossed, this kind of low risk in a corporate management way to making those promises?
No, this is very high risk and very high return. So it is very high risk, and many, if not nearly all of these companies will go bankrupt. Physics and nature is a hard barrier. And so you might make a claim, but that doesn't mean its nature is going to support it. I think many of these companies, as I said, if not nearly all, will go bankrupt. And the biggest danger to me is that it wipes out the public sector with it, because it has long-term attraction, but there is a risk of being overcapitalized at an early point in time, that it will have knock-on effects to the research sector more broadly. And to a degree, the public sector overpromised during the oil shocks in the late 1970s, and they promised fusion too early. The level of investment that was suggested at the time by the US wasn't realised, but they did overpromise to a degree. And I don't want to see the same thing happen, because that would set back fusion energy development. I think the best way to accept the private sector investment is to accept that it is high return, but it is very high risk, and to acknowledge that and to say, look, this does demitigate various risks, but it's a very high speculative gain. Would I bet my house on it? Absolutely not.
Could you give us what your predictions are? How long do you think it will be before some of the outstanding major research issues are solved to do with continual reactions or creating the materials that are able to withstand the high temperatures for long enough? After that, how long do you imagine it might take to deploy fusion at scale where it's going to actually affect people's lives on a day-to-day basis?
I still believe that the ITER project is still probably the most realistic in terms of time frame. And that's not aiming to develop burning plasma experiments until late 2030s. The scientific and technological demonstration of fusion energy is most realistically not going to occur until ITER has demonstrated it. And it probably will be ITER that demonstrates it. It's unlikely to have the necessary knowledge for at least a decade. Even if you have that demonstration, how quickly can you turn that around to produce power? Realistically, I don't see this happening before the middle of the century. And that's understanding that fusion power plants, for the most part, are gigawatt electric devices. They're large facilities. So I want to build a coal-fired power station right now. It's going to take basically 10 years to build. Even if you do it at maximum construction speed, you've still got to site it, you've got to get regulatory permission. Even if you ramp all those things through and say, well, okay, I don't care about any of the emissions and so forth associated with it, it's still going to take 5 years to build.
So would you say, in your opinion, that having at-scale international operation of fusion energy in national grids in the 2050s would still be relatively optimistic?
At scale, I think that's probably true. You might have some contribution to the grid, but I think at scale, a significant fraction of the grid, I think that's unlikely by 2050. It's depressing at some level because climate change is such an immediate problem and requires a solution like fusion together with renewables. And there are some countries like Australia that's blessed with lots of renewable energy sources and can make a dent, but that won't be true globally. And climate change is a global thing. It doesn't matter what one country does. All of them have to do it at scale to make it work. I'd love to think that Australia would have a larger footprint in this space, in particular in terms of the degree to which it engages in international science. I think this is something that small nations sometimes fail with because the rest of the world is a long way from its geographic borders. What tends to happen is the research that's conducted in Australia tends to be quite insular and not particularly international. The main thing I would like to see more of in Australia is much more global engagement with some of the world's challenges, of which fusion is one, but there are plenty of others. That's a challenge that occurs smaller nations that are surrounded by lots of water. Amazingly, New Zealand is much more technologically ready than Australia in this space, partly because it's got a fusion, a larger scale, open star technology activity, but also partly because they're just a bit more embracing. Unfortunately, the Australian government, whether it's left or right, is still controlled by the fossil fuel industry to a very large degree. Australia's a giant mine, and whoever owns the mine controls the incumbent government of left or right persuasion, so it's disappointing from that respect.
My thanks to Professor Hole for coming on the podcast, and to Vasco Kostovsky for our audio engineering. As always, there's further reading in the blurb below, and lots more to find on our website, landclimate.org. In the past few weeks, we've published our investigation with The Guardian into health and safety issues amongst workers at bioenergy power plants, as well as guest articles from experts about climate's tipping points at the Earth's poles, the oppression of environmental defenders in Honduras, and much more. So do take a minute to have a look. Follow us and leave a review if you enjoyed this episode, and we'll be back with another interview in 2 weeks' time. Until then, goodbye, and thanks for listening.